This is the fourth lesson in a series that I've entitled Understanding the Woke Revolution. Today I want us to tie a couple of very important pieces together in understanding why we're where we're at in our culture today. In the last 24 hours, there's been some things that have happened that have really grabbed my attention and frankly upset me some. I listened to a teacher in Virginia last night stand before the school board and express to the school board as a Christian that he had deep reservations about addressing trans students according to their preferred pronoun. He felt like he was lying to call a boy a girl or girl boy. He didn't talk for a long time. It was less than a minute. He was immediately suspended from his job. I listened to a mother this morning who was very concerned because her child, fixing to enter school, was going to be subjected to critical race theory teaching in the school, and she wanted to look at the materials and review them. The school board is now threatening to sue her for requesting these materials. There's a child's cartoon series, Blue's Clues. I remember my grandkids watching Blue's Clues. I saw a piece of one of those this morning. This is, by the way, National Pride Month, being June. And it's a 3-minute piece in which a drag queen sings while a parade goes by. And in this parade are various formulations of trans, queer, pangender, polyamorous families of different kinds. And of course, everything's beautiful and everything's love. And this is being, couldn't believe it, man, this is being done for little kids. Little kids, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, are sitting and they're watching this. And I kept asking myself, how in the world have we come to this? How did we get here? Well, as we talked about in my last lesson, the roots of part of this movement go back to this whole idea of you can't know what's true. Whatever you're told is true, you may believe is true, but the fact of the matter is that objectively you don't know if it's true or not. And so if I believe something, I have a personal conviction about it, that's my truth. But if you have a personal conviction about something and it's differing from mine, but you believe it's true, then it's your truth. And what right do I have to question your truth or you to question my truth? The argument being in postmodernism that there may be an objective truth out there somewhere, but who's going to know exactly what it is? And the fact of the matter is they will argue that our modern culture, our white-dominated culture, our European culture, has dictated what is true according to their particular point of view, which may not necessarily coincide with other ethnic or racial groups. And so basically, what postmodernism has done is taken truth and kind of thrown it up in the air and said, well, it's just whatever you think it is. Now, that's really important. And we talked about some of the flaws in that logic last week, but I want you to keep that in mind because it kind of sets the basis for what I want us to think about today. There's a marriage that's taken place, kind of an unholy marriage, in the thought that underlies the woke culture that we have today. And it has its roots in a marriage between postmodernism on the one hand and neo-Marxism on the other. Now, most of you have heard of Marx and Engels, and basically what Marx did was formulate a theory that human history can basically be defined by economic conflict and the power associated with that economic conflict. In other words, the bourgeois, people that have money, the elite, they control and dominate. They dictate what's going to be believed, what's going to be done, and they hold down what's called the proletariat or the general populace. And what periodically happens is that the proletariat will rise up in rebellion against the bourgeois and throw them off, and begin hopefully what would be a more egalitarian, more equal, more equitable society. The fact of the matter is that this social communist experiment was tried over and over again in the 20th century, and it was a horrible, horrible mess. It was a disaster. Lenin and Stalin tried it in Russia, and the result was tens of millions of people who died of starvation. Zedong tried it in China, and the result again was tens of millions of people who died. Pol Pot tried it in Cambodia, and the result of that were the infamous killing fields where millions more died. In the 21st century, you can see this experiment going on in Venezuela, and it's a horrible mess there. I had an opportunity to visit with a young man who had been living in Venezuela with his family and had to flee Venezuela to come to Colombia. While I was in Colombia, I visited with him, and he was almost in tears as he talked about how beautiful his country had been and what life was like when he was a child, and how when socialists took over, the mess that resulted, the absolute chaos and anarchy in every way that came about. And it just broke his heart to see his country in the situation it is today. My point is this: there are all kinds of theories out there about how to make more equitable, more just societies. And we have plenty of people today who are very critical of capitalism. And they have every right to be very critical of capitalism. Capitalism certainly has its flaws. But so does socialism, so does communism, so does a monarchy. The fact of the matter is, and let me just move to a kind of a side thought for a moment, but I think it's an important one. I believe any political or social structure that we try to operate in or on is automatically going to be flawed because it's run by human beings. And as human beings, the Scripture is pretty clear about our situation. Paul will write in Romans 3, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. There is none righteous, no, not even one. John will write in 1 John chapter 1, if a man says that he hasn't sinned, he's a liar, and the truth isn't in him. The fact of the matter is that as human beings, we're flawed. Any government that we try to run is automatically going to be flawed. I don't care what our intentions are, as noble as they might be, simply by the fact that we're human beings. And I think history will bear me out on this. In fact, just think about biblical examples. Solomon, when he's a kid and he comes to the throne, he's scared to death of the responsibility that's going to fall on his shoulders. He pleads with God to grant him wisdom. God gives him wisdom, gives him riches, and the rest of this story ought to be, wow. There's this wonderful period in Israel's history. The truth of the matter is, he gets all caught up in himself, all wrapped up in his power and his influence and satisfying his physical desires, and he creates a mess that is so bad that when his son takes over the throne, the kingdom rips apart. David, shepherd king, great heart. But after he becomes king and he sits on the throne for a while, what's he end up doing? Stealing the wife of one of his most trusted men, and then making sure that that man gets killed as he tries to cover it up. My point is that as human beings, it doesn't make any difference what the system is. The system is going to be flawed by our humanness. And on top of that, what we must do then is build into the system as many protections as we can. To me, one of the brilliant things about what happened in the United States and its formulation of the Constitution was our founding fathers did their dead level best to try to make sure that government could not become totalitarian. That there were checks and balances built into the government to keep that from happening, to keep government from dominating. I think that's really important. And what we find today, of course, right now, one of the things that troubles me is all this talk about, well, the Constitution's over 200 years old, it's out of date, we just need to throw it out, we need to come up with a whole new way of looking at things. And if you're not real careful, folks, what we're going to run right back into is another form of totalitarianism. Because basically, if you read history, what I see is one totalitarian system succeeding another. And these totalitarian systems, because they consider capitalism a totalitarian system. Well, fine. Let's replace it with a totalitarian system of socialism. Well, totalitarian is totalitarian. And automatically, those systems are going to be flawed by the human beings who try to run them. I just think we need to look at that and think about that. Now, how has all this worked into what we see today? Well, one of the things that the Marxist grabbed hold of was this idea of ongoing conflict between the bourgeois and the proletariat. And the fact that if you could get the proletariat stirred up, then they would overthrow the bourgeois and establish a more egalitarian, more equitable system. Okay, a system in which the people owned production, the people controlled distribution, and thus it wasn't all in the hands of just a few rich people up at the top. How do you get that to happen? How do you bring that about? Well, okay, basically what you need is a revolution, right? How do you get a revolution? Well, you stir people up. You get them upset. So, how do you get people upset? Well, they were facing something of a problem here in Western Europe and in our Western culture, and that was that overall people were doing pretty well economically. And so they weren't all that upset. So, what developed in Germany in the 1920s and then eventually crossed the Atlantic and came over here was a system called critical thinking. And critical thinking was designed to look at the flaws in the system and emphasize those flaws, and in emphasizing those flaws, get people upset. Well, if you couldn't attack things economically because things were going pretty well, where do you go? Well, obviously, you go to race and you go to sex, which is exactly what has happened and where we are right now in this woke revolution. You begin to put tremendous emphasis on the difference that exists in races. The fact that the white race is economically operating on a much higher level than are blacks and browns, and put emphasis on the fact that because whites are in control, they suppress and hold down these other races, don't allow them to succeed as they could otherwise. And so what has to be done is to overthrow the white patriarchy, to establish a new system of governing that's more equitable and fair, and put the production in the hands of the people rather than in the hands of the Jeff Bezos and the Bill Gates and the others. That's the whole idea. That's the premise. Now, how do you go about that? Well, you can't really argue it class-wise, because when you start looking at economic classes, those cross races. Okay, so you don't want to talk about economic classes. In fact, this is real interesting. I'll just toss this in. The highest earning ethnic racial group in this country are Asians. On average, the average Asian income household income is about $20,000 per year more than the average white household income, which is about $20,000 more than the average Hispanic household income, which is about $10,000 more than the average black household income. But you see, when you start talking about economics, whites are not at the top. Asian Americans are at the top as far as the amount of money that's made by the average household. And so, what do you fall back on? Well, how about what they now call, what we call identity politics, where basically you just take a racial group and everybody believes the same thing. And so all whites are racist. All whites enjoy white privilege. black people, brown people are victims, and they're being used and taken advantage of by the whites. Now, multiple levels, that really aggravates me because it's so unfair. For one thing, it paints with a broad brush and tars with a broad brush. And that's not fair, because I don't appreciate anybody telling me what I believe. I know what I believe, and when somebody starts telling me, well, you believe this because, or I have no right to tell somebody else, well, because you're this color, you believe this. Not necessarily so at all. But that's exactly what happens in identity politics. I listened to a Korean the other day, preacher, speaking at a conference in Chicago, and he just made me furious. And I'm not quoting him exactly, but this is really close, and I could give you the reference. You could go look at the tape and listen to the guy too. But basically what he said was, well, you know, whites treat blacks in a way where they are either pets or threats. And immediately I was furious. How dare you say that? That's scurrilous. That's slander. I don't know of anybody who views blacks in that way. But I mean, he said it. There are cheers, claps, people agreeing, this kind of thing. It's designed to incense, and it's designed to divide. And that's the whole critical theory point of identity politics is we want people divided, we want people upset, because when they're divided and when they're upset, that's when revolution can take place and the system that's in existence can be overthrown. And so they go with race, and then, and this to me is a stroke of genius on their part, and it's frightening to me too. They go, you know what we need to do? We need to separate the biological person from the psychological person. We need to establish two identities. And back in the 70s, they begin to move in this direction. And what I mean by that is this. Now you hear all this talk about sex versus gender. And you can't help the sex that you're born with. You are born male or you are born female. You're double X or you're XY. Okay? But you can choose your gender. You can choose, even though you're born a male, you can choose to be a female. Even though you're born a female, you can choose to be a male. Now the roots of this go back 40, 50, 60 years to writings of early feminists and others that I've read who really were resentful. In essence, some of them, that they had been born as a woman because really they felt they were disempowered then to do a lot of the things they would like to do. They would prefer to be a man. And so there became, on multiple levels, this desire to just do away with sexual differences. And you see that today, right? There's no difference between men and women. No difference. You hear this all the time. There's no difference between men and women. No difference between men and women. Well, that's ridiculous. I mean, objectively, there's all kinds of differences between men and women. But here's what they've done, okay? They know that. They know you can't really argue that logically. They know that. So, what have they done? Well, let's separate out the physical person from the psychological person, or from the expressive personality, they call it. And so now what you're saying is, yeah, I'm Dan, but maybe inside I'm Dana. And if I choose to be Dana, that's really who I am. I'm being authentic to myself. I'm rising above my physical body, and I'm truly expressing the authentic me. And the authentic me is Dana. Now, once you move into feelings, and feelings take priority over facts, and that's exactly what they've done. Okay, because they know they can't win in an objective discussion. They can't. And so let's get completely away from objective facts, and let's move into but this is how I feel. Because now it's amorphous. Now it's like punching a cloud. Now it's just well, how can you tell me that my feelings are wrong? And so what we find now is they have set up this major battle. You see, I began to wonder several years ago, why the big deal about transgenderism? It's so rare. It's so very, very rare. Why has it become this battle cry? Why is it this big deal? Because it's the ground that they choose to fight on, because here's where they can separate out the physical person from the psychological person and argue that really what you need to focus on and pay attention to is the psychological person, because that's who you really are. And if you're authentic to yourself and you're not allowing your family or Christianity or white culture to dictate to you who you are, your personality, because you see, they see all those forces as oppressive. All those forces as pushing people into a mold. And so, how dare you raise your little girl and you put dresses on her? Or how dare you raise your little boy and you let him play with tractors? No, you're trying to shape who they are. You just need to let them find out and figure out who they are. Well, again, if you're born male, chances are that's the way you're going to act. If you're born female, chances are that's the way that you're going to act. That's the way you're going to be. But if you can try to separate this out and emphasize, again, the psychological part of a person and say that's what you have to pay attention to, their feelings, that's because they're being authentic, then you have created this incredible divide that we see today. And what they've done is taken that and they've piggybacked that onto race as a civil rights issue. Well, the thing is, I can't control my melatonin and you can't either. We're born with the melatonin we're born with. That's something that can't be changed. But psychologically, yeah, you can change your identity from male to female to whatever repeatedly. And so that's something that you find this tremendous confusion and argument going on over today. Now, it's interesting, you know, when you think about it, we live in a day and age where the individual and individual rights are being tremendously emphasized. I mean, I call it a Burger King mentality. It's all about have it your way. Everybody wants to have it their way. And there's this tremendous push toward expressing yourself individually. And again, this argument that's being presented that there is no way that Dan can be his true self as long as his society is trying to shape him into something that they've decided he ought to be. They've decided Dan ought to be a male, and so Dan ought to wear these clothes, and Dan ought to play football, and Dan ought to do this, and Dan ought to do that, rather than just allowing Dan to find himself and determine his own identity. The fact of the matter is that society does shape us, and that's very important. I mean, how are we going to function if all of us are going in our own direction, doing our own thing, and we never interact, we never cooperate, we don't have to? The fact of the matter is that what some paint as a utopia, I would argue is far more probably going to turn into a dystopian nightmare. Because who's going to determine who does what? Who's going to tell me what I can do and not do? Who can I tell what they can do and not do? You have to have, in any society, in any culture, there must be a structure of power. There has to be. Society can't function otherwise. The problem is, who's going to set up top and who's going to dictate that? Who's going to decide what's moral and what's immoral, what's right and what's wrong? Particularly when you have decided that you are going to toss out traditional Judeo-Christian values. That those are no longer going to be held to because those are awful things. Those are repressive and those keep people from finding themselves fulfilled. And so we've got to get rid of those things. Again, who's going to dictate? Who's going to tell us what the rules are? Well, what you're going to encounter automatically, it must be this way, is a totalitarian system of values that are based on power. Because people have maneuvered themselves into a situation where they can dictate to everybody else what's going to be. Now, think about just a couple of practical things real quick as I bring this to a close. There's a big thing now about proper pronouns. Hi, my name's Dan and my pronouns are he, him. Okay, well, okay, that's fine as far as identifying yourself goes. But here's the thing. You see, people aren't requesting that I use their pronouns. They're demanding that I use their pronouns. Because you see, we have moved past, well, you have to accept me as I am to know you must go ahead and applaud who I am. Not just accept who I am, but you have to affirm me. Now, affirmation is really important. It is. We all need and desire affirmation. But the second that I demand affirmation from you, I demand it and I expect it. And if affirmation is not given, it's criminalized, and that's the direction it's moving in England and Canada right now, is if that kind of affirmation isn't given, it's criminalized, then what you have is not freedom. What you have is totalitarianism, where others are dictating to you what you're going to say and how you're going to react. Is that really where we want to go and what we want? On top of that, I want you to think about a couple of scenarios if this were actually carried out as some would push it as far as personal identity goes. So here's an individual who has decided this is an XX chromosome who's decided that he's going to be an XY chromosome. He's not, but he's going to be. And so he undergoes surgery. He has the shots, the hormones, the whole bit. He's in a car accident and he's taken to the hospital. How are the doctors supposed to treat him? Because he has declared that he's a female, even though he's a male. The doctor in the emergency room is in a real conundrum. Seriously, what's he going to do? How is he going to react to this individual? How is he going to treat him or her? It's a real problem, a real challenge, and it's a kind of thing that's going to come up, because the second that you ignore reality and exist in a fantasy world, and that's what you're doing, and then reality intrudes, does fantasy override reality? Because in essence, they're demanding that in everything, fantasy overrides reality. Fantasy dictates, feelings dictate, not reality. I meet a young woman. She has an eating disorder. She's struggling with anorexia nervosa. She sees herself as too fat. She's thin and she's starving herself to death. What am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to affirm her? Am I supposed to say, well, yeah, honey, you do look a little heavy. You probably do need to quit eating. Because you don't want to hurt her feelings, you need to affirm her, right? Because feelings are what it's all about, correct? You see, in a situation like that, people will go, oh, no, that's ridiculous, that's crazy. I would argue, yes, it is. That girl needs help. People with gender dysphoria need help. There are all kinds of situations that we encounter where we don't need affirmation. Perhaps we need to be challenged and be aided. And we're not blessing people or helping people if we allow them to continue in these states of what amount to fantasy. Particularly when that fantasy is being pushed off on and foisted off on everyone else in such a totalitarian way that it must absolutely be accepted. Bottom line, as much criticism as there is being directed today toward biblical principles, biblical morals, biblical values, traditional Judeo-Christian ethics, the fact of the matter is, folks, they work. And they have worked for thousands and thousands of years. They protect us, they unite us, they provide a solid basis for building a home and raising children in a secure environment. They give us protection from moving in directions that ultimately can be physically and psychologically harmful to us. They establish important boundaries. They dictate an attitude toward each other of understanding and love that's very, very important. Do we really want to toss those out and replace those with some kind of man-made set of standards? that ultimately leads to nothing but confusion and ultimately to all kinds of pain and death, because, again, go back to the 20th century and take a look at what's been produced. Now, in the final lesson, I want us to spend some time talking about some of the words that you hear bandied about a lot today. Words like diversity and inclusivity and equity and critical thinking. And I want us to delve in a little deeper into those to really begin to understand what's being talked about. Because on the surface, to be honest with you, what's happening is those words are being used with a completely different meaning probably than you see them as having by those who would advocate and use those constantly. I think it's very important that we understand that. And so the fifth lesson, that's the kind of thing we're going to touch on. Thank you for listening. God bless, and may He continue to help all of us to be a light in this world. Thank you.